On February 1st, the finance minister will rise to present the union budget for the next financial year. That is the financial year 2023-2024. It starts in April 2023 and ends in March 2024. Now, very simply put, it tells us about three things. One, the amount of money that the government is planning to or hopes to raise in the next financial year. Two, the amount of money that it typically wants to spend in the next financial year. And three, the amount of borrowing that it has to do from the market to meet the gap. And there is typically a gap in the government finances. Governments in developing countries tend to spend more than they earn. These economies are weaker, people don't earn as much, so it can't raise as much money. And so the gap has to be fulfilled by higher borrowings. And this is roughly called the fiscal deficit. And these are the three most important things to understand what is the government trying to do in the budget. But how does a government go about making the budget? So let's take it step by step. So the main problem when you prepare a budget for the next financial year is to figure out what would be the size of the Indian economy. What would be the total output of the Indian economy? Because everything depends on the nominal GDP. GDP, as you understand, is the total market value of all goods and services, final goods and services that are produced in India. So without knowing that, the government cannot progress because everything depends on this nominal GDP number. Professor N.R. Bhanumurthy, who's Vice Chancellor of the B.R. Ambedkar School of Economics, says that it's Lord Ganesh of the union budget. It's a starting point without which you cannot proceed. Now, nominal GDP is different from real GDP because real GDP typically takes away the inflation effect. Nominal GDP is whatever is the market value, current market value. Now, as you know, the finance minister is talking or presenting the budget on the 1st of February. The current financial year hasn't ended, so we don't know the nominal GDP of the current financial year. And we are projecting it for the next financial year. So it's based on certain assumptions. So the first thing is to understand that the finance minister makes an assumption about the current year nominal GDP and then uses that, marks it up by 10% or 11% or 12%, depending on their expectation of what the economy would be next year, to create a number called the nominal GDP for the next financial year. Now, once the government knows the nominal GDP of the economy or likely nominal GDP of the economy in the next financial year, the first thing it does is to create a number called the fiscal deficit. Now, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, the FRBM Act, stipulates that India's fiscal deficit for the union budget cannot be more than 3% of the nominal GDP. So the first thing the government has to do before figuring out what money it can raise or where it can spend and how much it can spend is to figure out what is the ultimate limit of the money it can borrow from the market. So it calculates the nominal GDP, then calculates 3% of the nominal GDP. That gives you the stipulated number. Often enough, like in the last few years, governments have exceeded the fiscal deficit limit because they've had to spend more. But at least it creates a number called the fiscal deficit, says this is the number, and then it targets, maybe this year we'll keep it to 4% or 5% or whatever, depending on the economic situation. So that's step two. Figuring out how much can the government borrow. Step three is to look at then how much money can they raise from the economy. Now, typically, if the economy is growing fast, if the economy is growing at 12%, and the government hopes that with every 1% increase in the overall GDP, they'll also be able to get a 1% increase in their revenues, the government can make a certain assumption that this is the amount of money we'll be able to raise because the taxes run in a certain rhythm with the larger economy. If the economy was growing, everybody was earning more money, people were spending more money, the taxes accruing to the government would also run in that fashion. Now, government typically gets revenues not just from the taxes, but also from, say, non-tax revenues like dividends that government-owned undertakings give to the government. If LIC makes a lot of money, if a public sector banks make a lot of money, that money also goes to the government. And also there is a third element called the disinvestment. Government can sell off certain stake in public sector units or totally privatize them and raise certain money. So the next step is to figure out how much money can the government raise now that it already knows that this is the max that it can borrow. The last step of the budget making is to then figure out how much money can the government spend. Now, this will depend on how much money the government finds it can borrow from the market and how much money it can raise from its own sources. And the two give it the sort of the budget constraint, as it were, on its total expenditure. So once it has the number for the total amount of money it has or it's likely to have in its kitty, it then figures out where does it want to spend it, in which department, what are the priorities for the current financial year. And every financial year has different challenges, so government's priorities can change a bit, but they also follow a more long term or a medium term framework over which the government wants to do things. Like the Modi government in the second term in particular has been pushing for more uh, infrastructure led growth. So, you would suspect that expenditure on those ministries would continue to be bolstered. So that basically concludes the budget process. Those are the 4 or 5 steps that you have to figure out how the budget is made.